The air in the basement of the old Queen Anne was a thick, stagnant breath, heavy with the scent of damp earth and aging cedar, a characteristic aroma of cypress root. The historic black neighborhood in Charleston, South Carolina, where the ancient water table lay just inches beneath the concrete foundation. Elara Vance Ames moved with the deliberate, graceful patience that defined her as a middle school librarian and a devoted mother. Her vibrant turquoise head wrap a startling splash of color against the dim, sickly yellow light cast by the single, buzzing bulb. She was kneeling by a trunk marked Memories and Miscellany, her fingers tracing the worn texture of a hand-stitched, indigo-dyed quilt made by her great-grandmother. Her husband, Mecky Ames, stood a few feet away, his broad, athletic frame casting a massive, restless shadow against the cold, gray walls. He was consulting engineer, accustomed to problems with clear, predictable solutions. Yet tonight, his usual calm was frayed, his eyes constantly flicking toward the rickety, paint-peeling stairs that led back up to the warmth of their kitchen. They were down here on a seemingly mundane mission, retrieving a box of vintage photographs for their son's 21st birthday celebration. Cairo, their son, was upstairs, ostensibly setting up a new gaming console he had insisted needed immediate calibration. The silence that followed the heavy clunk of the deadbolt was not the typical silence of their sprawling, echoing house. It was a pressurized, absolute void that swallowed the furnace's low hum and Elara's sharp, inhaled gasp. The sound, mechanical and definitive, vibrated in the soles of their shoes. Elara immediately dropped the photo box, the lid flying open to scatter black and white images across the floor, a miniature explosion of past joys that now seemed impossibly distant. Her mind, usually organized and logical, scrambled for an explanation, a strong gust of wind, a sticky lock, some forgotten structural quirk of the 150-year-old house. But the sound had been too precise, too heavy, like the closing of a vault. She rose quickly, her movements betraying the sudden surge of adrenaline, and rushed to the solid, 6-panel oak door, its surface cold and unyielding beneath her palm. She pounded on the wood, the impact jarring her bones, the sound muffled and lifeless, failing to penetrate the oppressive silence above. A terrifying thought solidified in her mind. Cairo wasn't playing a game. This was deliberate. Makey was already at the door beside her, his hand wrapped around the smooth, porcelain knob, turning it uselessly back and forth. His face, usually a canvas of deep serenity, was etched with a confusion that rapidly curdled into primal fear. He was a man who planned for everything, from structural integrity to financial futures. And this moment, this inexplicable imprisonment by their only child, was a terrifying deviation from the script. He yelled Cairo's name, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that shook the cobwebs from the rafters, demanding an immediate answer, a justification, a joke, anything to shatter the creeping reality that was settling over them. He pressed his ear against the cold wood, listening intently for the telltale sounds of a prankster's retreat, a suppressed giggle, or even the hurried thump-thump of Cairo's beloved German shepherd, Kofi. But there was nothing, only the thick, impenetrable silence of the house that now felt like a tomb. They were trapped, without cell phones, left charging upstairs in a pre-dinner ritual, and miles from the nearest neighbor who might hear their muffled cries. Elara backed away from the door, a low, guttural sound escaping her throat that wasn't quite a sob, but a raw articulation of disbelief and profound maternal pain. She remembered Cairo's demeanor at dinner, quiet, almost preternaturally calm, avoiding their eyes as he spoke only in clipped, non-committal answers about his upcoming move to New York for his architectural fellowship. He had seemed detached, but she had dismissed it as pre-departure nerves, the common anxiety of a beloved child preparing to launch into the world. Now, she realized the quietude was not nervousness. It was the chilling, steady calm of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan. The sudden understanding of the betrayal brought a stinging clarity to her panic, a focused, incandescent rage replacing the generalized fear. Why would he sabotage their life, their trust, their love, in this terrifying, isolating way? This wasn't the sweet, brilliant boy they had raised, the one who spent Saturdays volunteering at the community center. This was a calculated act of violence. Mickey's attention, however, suddenly shifted from the barricaded exit to a less used corner of the basement, near the cinder block foundation, where the water main pipe ascended. His eyes, fixed on a dark, almost charcoal-colored recess, narrowed with a terrible dawning recognition. He moved slowly, deliberately, his large frame suddenly condensing all its power into cautious silence, his gaze fixed on a small, dark object tucked beneath a roll of ancient jute carpet. He leaned down, pulling away the stiff, moth-eaten material, and revealed a small, scarred ebony wood lockbox, its surface intricately carved with West African Adinkra symbols that Alara vaguely recognized as belonging to Mickey's maternal lineage. It was a box she had never seen, and a wave of nausea washed over her as she realized the full, terrible implication of its presence. Mickey reached for it, his fingers closing over the cool, hard wood. He turned back to Alara, his lips barely moving as he delivered the terrifying, soul-chilling confession that ripped through the last vestiges of their shared reality. Quiet. I have a secret. Mickey's admission, a two-word tremor in the damp subterranean air, shattered the remaining illusion of their reality more effectively than Cairo's sudden betrayal. Alara stared at the ebony lockbox, cradled in her husband's massive hands, her gaze snapping back and forth from the carved, alien symbols on the wood to the tight, terrified lines around Mickey's mouth. The box was undeniably beautiful, a piece of deep, ancestral craft, yet it radiated an almost malevolent energy in the dim light. It was the physical manifestation of a profound omission, a secret that had been festering in the foundations of their marriage, a truth he had kept concealed even while they shared a bed, a budget, and the sacred task of raising their son. Her initial shock gave way to a cold, hard knot of anger. They had built their 25 years together on a bedrock of radical honesty, a commitment forged in their youth at Spelman and Morehouse, believing their union, unlike the fractured histories of many in their community, would be transparent and unshakable. Now, with a deadbolt sealing their fate and a heavy silence echoing from above, she realized their house was built on sand, concealing a darkness more insidious than the mere act of locking a door. Mickey, sensing the shift in her emotional state from fear to wounded interrogation, placed the lockbox gently on the rough workbench, its silence amplifying the heavy, unspoken accusations hanging between them. He ran his hand over the box's surface, not lovingly, but with the resigned touch of a man handling a burden he had carried too long. He began to speak, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that struggled to overcome the ambient noises of the old house, the distant, lonely drip of the water heater, the subtle groan of the floorboards above. He explained that the box had not come from his grandmother's estate. as he had implied in the first moment of panic, but had been given to him directly by his great-aunt, Aunt Zora, an elderly, fiercely private woman who had lived deep in the Gula territories of nearby Johns Island. Zora, who passed away 5 years prior, had not been simply passing on an heirloom. She had entrusted Meki with a specific, terrifying instruction upon her deathbed. Guard the box, never open it, and never speak of it, for it contained the root of the sickness in cypress root. Ilara knew Zora, a stern, wise matriarch known for her adherence to oral tradition and deep historical knowledge of their coastal region, and the memory of the woman's solemn intensity validated Meki's terror, momentarily dampening Ilara's anger with a surge of shared dread. Zora told me our family's good fortune. Our success in acquiring this specific property was tied to a broken pact, a covenant sealed not with God, but with a ghost, Meki whispered, leaning closer, his eyes scanning the low ceiling, as if expecting to see Cairo's silhouette looming above. He revealed that Zora had been a young woman in the 1940s when her father, Meki's grandfather, Elias Ames, had engineered the purchase of the Queen Anne house. Elias, a determined man who had returned from World War II with a clear vision of prosperity, found himself in a complex, racially charged bidding war for the property, with a highly respected, successful Black entrepreneur named Okonkwo Oke Adebayo, whose family had owned the land for generations before being displaced by Reconstruction-era debt. Elias ultimately won the house, not through legitimate channels, but through a calculated, devastating maneuver. He exploited a vulnerability in the Adebayo family's title paperwork, essentially claiming the house by leveraging a debt that Okonkwo had taken on to save his younger brother from a false imprisonment charge. The transaction was legal on paper, sealed by a crooked lawyer in the segregation-era county office, but morally bankrupt, a fundamental act of intra-racial betrayal. The weight of this historical sin, committed by the patriarch who had launched Meki's family line into the middle class, settled heavily in the basement air, cold and undeniable. Ilara's initial anger at Meki softened into a profound, chilling sadness, realizing her husband hadn't been maliciously secretive. He had been silently burdened by the generational shame of a moral crime. She looked at the lockbox again, understanding its true nature. It was not an heirloom, but a reliquary of guilt. "And Cairo," she prompted, her voice barely a breath. "How does he know? Did Zora tell him?" Meki shook his head slowly, his features contorted in helplessness. He explained that the lockbox itself was not the secret, but the key to the secret. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately folded piece of wax paper, a piece he had always carried, thinking it was a simple prayer or charm. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a thin line of tiny, almost microscopic script in Zora's distinctive, elegant hand, a single, cryptic instruction: "The root knows the fruit. Look where the sorrow rests." Meki stood, his back straight, and slowly approached the area directly beneath the dining room, where they had always experienced a peculiar, persistent draft, no matter how many times they insulated the floor. He tapped the concrete floor rhythmically with the heel of his boot, listening, a deep, professional sense for structural anomalies, now fused with his desperate search for a hidden truth. Thump, thump, thump. He stopped at a point where the concrete sounded distinctly hollow, perhaps less than an inch thick. He picked up the heavy, old-fashioned pipe wrench from the workbench, its cold steel shocking against his skin, and lifted it high. Before he could strike, a low, ominous scrape sounded directly above them, a sound of heavy, unyielding furniture being dragged across the hardwood floor, the unmistakable sound of the dining room hutch, a massive mahogany piece, being pulled into place directly over the entrance to the basement. It was a secondary, definitive barricade. Cairo wasn't waiting for them to break out. He was ensuring they stayed put. The message was clear, terrifying, and visually cinematic. They were not just locked in. They were buried alive by their own son over a secret that now pulsed with an unbearable, ancestral weight. Meki lowered the pipe wrench, his body trembling not from the physical strain, but from the terrifying realization that their son, Cairo, was not just acting on impulse. He was employing a strategy, a deliberate escalation of their imprisonment. The sound of the mahogany hutch scraping into place upstairs was a powerful, cinematic tableau of parental rejection and calculated control. It was the sound of a family bond snapping under the stress of an ancestral secret. Ilara watched him, her hand instinctively reaching out, not to comfort him, but to steady herself on his arm, finding a sudden, unexpected anchor in the man who had just confessed to decades of profound omission. The terror of being locked in began to be eclipsed by the deeper, more unsettling fear of why Cairo felt this elaborate action was necessary. It wasn't just punishment. It felt like a desperate, preemptive measure to ensure Meki couldn't use whatever was hidden beneath the concrete. "He knows I know about the hollow spot," Meki muttered, his voice hoarse, his gaze fixed on the ceiling above. He finally brought the heavy wrench down, not in a destructive blow, but a light tap on the specific spot where the sound had been hollowest, where the density of the concrete suddenly changed. The sound was distinct, a thin, brittle crack that confirmed the concrete patch was newer, weaker, deliberately poured to conceal something below. "Zora didn't just give me the box, Ilara. She gave me a map. She taught me about the root, the foundation of the house where the sorrow rests. That sorrow is this lie, this theft from the Adebayo family." He adjusted the grip on the wrench, his professional engineering mind taking over, momentarily overriding the panic of the father. He knew a demolition job would be too loud, too likely to draw Cairo's attention, who was clearly stationed right above them, listening. He needed to be meticulous, to chip away the concrete around the edges of the patch with the focused precision he used for complex structural renovations. A slow, agonizing process that mirrored the agonizing reveal of his own family's history. As Meki began the painstaking process, the rhythmic chip, chip, chip of the wrench against the concrete, filling the small space, Ilara knelt and began gathering the spilled photographs, their shared history now scattered and exposed. Much like their marriage, she picked up an image of Cairo at age 10, beaming in his first Little League uniform, his 2 front teeth missing, and another of her and Meki on their graduation day, their faces alight with the limitless hope of their young, talented black love. The juxtaposition of those innocent memories against the current, suffocating reality brought fresh tears to her eyes. Less of fear now, and more of profound, heartbreaking grief. She recognized the chilling dynamic at play. Cairo had taken the narrative control, forcing them into this confined space to confront a truth Meki had desperately tried to bury. She realized Cairo hadn't just found the secret. He had been actively, silently investigating it, perhaps for years, using the deep curiosity and resourcefulness they had always praised in him. He was performing an intervention, a forced reckoning with the family's sin, and their imprisonment was the terrifying consequence of his need for justice. Meki worked with silent, desperate concentration for what felt like an eternity, sweat beading on his brow despite the basement's chill. He managed to pry loose the thin, brittle concrete patch. Beneath it lay not a larger box or a hidden compartment, but a collection of brittle yellowed papers, tied together with a faded crimson ribbon, tucked neatly inside a heavy clear glass jar, sealed with thick, black wax. The jar itself was the protective casing, a makeshift time capsule buried beneath the foundation. He pulled it out gently, the jar cold and heavy in his hands, and carefully scraped away the sealing wax. As he pulled the brittle papers out, they gave off a faint, sweet, musty odor, the distinct perfume of old paper and forgotten floral arrangements, perhaps a funeral bouquet. The papers were not ledgers or deeds. They were handwritten, passionate letters, penned in a sweeping, elegant script that Ilara immediately recognized as belonging to Okonkwo Ok Adebayo, the man Meki's grandfather had betrayed. Meki quickly scanned the first page, his eyes widening as he read, his professional calm crumbling into utter devastation. The letters were addressed to Elias Ohms, Meki's grandfather, and they painted a vivid, agonizing picture of the betrayal, detailing not just the financial maneuvering over the house, but a far deeper, personal treachery. Okonkwo Adebayo and Elias Ames had not just been rivals, they had been best friends, comrades who had fought side by side in the war, promising to lift their community together. The letters revealed that the debt Elias leveraged was not just a title issue, but a trust issue. Okonkwo had confided in Elias about the vulnerability in his property title, while he was trying to secure his brother's release, placing his life savings and reputation in Elias's hands. Elias had not only stolen the property, but had also systematically ruined Okonkwo's business reputation in Cyprus Root, ensuring no one would lend him money, effectively exiling the Adebayo family. The letters were a searing chronicle of a descent into poverty, ending with a final desperate note, written just days before the Adebayos were forced to leave Charleston. A final prophetic line cutting through the decades. The root you planted in betrayal will bear the bitterest fruit in your own line, Elias. Ilara felt the weight of those words, a moral curse that seemed to resonate directly with the situation upstairs. Cairo was the bitter fruit. He had somehow intercepted this history, absorbing the Adebayo's generational pain, and was now enacting the prophecy of Elias's betrayal. The lockbox was merely a lure. The true secret was the Adebayo archive, the proof of the original sin, buried and preserved. Just as the devastating emotional impact of the letters was sinking in, a light, rhythmic tapping began directly above them near the chimney line. Tap, 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 tap. It was not frantic. It was measured, steady, and utterly unfamiliar. Ilara looked at Meki, whose eyes were wide with a new, fresh terror. "That's not Cairo," he whispered, recognizing the sound of someone else's presence in their house. Cairo wouldn't tap. He would yell. Someone else is upstairs, monitoring this. Someone who knew exactly where to find us and exactly what we would find. The lock was not the end. It was the beginning of an orchestrated family drama, and they were the unwitting, trapped actors in a performance directed by a hidden hand. The measured tapping from above, slow, rhythmic, and alien, froze Meki and Ilara, their fear transforming into an icy, crystalline dread. It was the sound of a silent, outside force closing in. Meki finally understood the full, terrifying scope of Cairo's action. Their son hadn't just imprisoned them, he had delivered them. He was not the puppet master, but the terrified instrument of a larger, external will, a will that was now physically occupying their house. Meki quickly gathered the brittle Adebayo letters and tucked them into the front pocket of his jeans, the paper rustling like dry leaves against the denim. He grabbed the pipe wrench again, the cold steel feeling strangely comforting, a blunt defense against the unseen enemy upstairs. Ilara, her mind racing, pointed toward the small, wooden shelf above the workbench, where Meki kept his old construction hard hat and a powerful, industrial-grade LED lantern he used for site inspections. Its beam, she knew, could cut through the dark of the basement like a knife, and perhaps, more importantly, it could reach the ventilation shafts. Meki snatched the lantern, flicking the switch. A blinding, pure white beam erupted, carving a sharp path through the gloom and instantly making the single dangling bulb look dim and obsolete. He aimed the powerful light at the small, square ventilation shaft near the ceiling, the source of the tapping. The shaft was covered by a rusty metal grill, but through the slats, they could just make out a dark shape pressed against the opening, a shape that immediately drew back from the glare of the light. The tapping stopped. They held their breath, listening to the strained silence. Then, a voice, muffled, low, and utterly unknown to them, drifted down the shaft, not directed at them, but speaking to someone else, presumably Cairo, on the other side of the basement door. The voice was calm, cultured, and carried a chilling authority. The box is revealed, the archive is retrieved. The final piece is in place. Maintain your position, Ames. The use of their family name, spoken with such casual possession, made Ilara's skin crawl, confirming the deep, orchestrated nature of their ordeal. Meki dropped the wrench and rushed to the basement door, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He hammered on the solid oak, his shouts now directed not at his son, but at the voice that had just claimed ownership of their tragedy. Cairo! Who is that? Get them out of our house! Cairo! The scraping sound of the mahogany hutch being pushed slightly further into place was the only devastating reply. Ilara went cold, a sudden, blinding insight crashing through her fear. The outside party knew the history of the Adebayo family, knew about the lockbox, and they clearly had a relationship with Cairo that preceded their current imprisonment. She remembered Cairo mentioning a research mentor he had met through his architectural program, a brilliant, passionate historian focusing on land theft and black displacement in the coastal South. Cairo had only ever referred to him as Professor Zaid. Could this calm, chilling voice belong to him? A man Cairo trusted, now using him to execute a plan rooted in generational revenge? Meki turned away from the door, his face a mask of furious determination. His engineering mind now focused on escape. He aimed the lantern at the joists supporting the first floor, running his eyes over the ancient, sturdy wood. The floor is solid pine, tongue and groove. No cutting that without heavy power tools, he murmured, his thoughts already ahead of the immediate problem. The stone foundation is 2 feet thick, no way out through the walls. He paused, his gaze settling on the narrow, wooden basement stairs leading up to the barricaded door. He suddenly noticed a small, nearly invisible scratch in the 3rd step from the bottom, a mark he had always dismissed as wear and tear. But now, with the Adebayo history exposed and the external threat confirmed, he saw it differently. He knelt and ran his fingers over the faint scratch. It wasn't random. It looked like a shallow, deliberately scored line. He remembered a story Aunt Zora used to tell him about how the old houses in Cypress Root had small, inconspicuous haint gaps, hollow spots or hiding places built into the structure by their enslaved ancestors to store precious items or provide emergency warnings. He pushed hard on the third stair riser. It didn't budge. He then tried pressing simultaneously on the riser in the tread above it. With a soft, barely audible click, the riser panel, roughly 8 inches high, in the width of the stair, popped inward slightly, revealing a narrow, dark space behind it. Ilara gasped, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and renewed terror at the secrets this house continued to cough up. Meki reached into the opening, his fingers brushing against something cool and metallic. He pulled it out, a beautifully intricate, antique brass skeleton key, its teeth stylized into the shape of a flowering magnolia branch. It was too old, too ornate to be the current key to the deadbolt above, but the key's intricate carving instantly resonated with the Adinkra symbols carved into the ebony lockbox. The key was the final component in Zora's cryptic warning, the physical representation of the lock that wasn't the door, but the ancestral shame. Meki looked from the key to the lockbox, realizing the key was not meant to open the box, but to unlock the next stage of the secret. He gently pressed the tip of the key's teeth against the most prominent Adinkra symbol on the box, a stylized heart known as Sankofa, meaning return and get it. As the key touched the wood, a soft, internal thrum resonated within the box. A small hidden compartment on the underside of the ebony case snapped open, revealing not more documents, but a single, thick micro SD card. This was the culmination of Zora's plan, the digital proof that could survive fire, water, and generations of neglect. The moment Meki held the tiny modern card, a piece of 21st century technology hidden within a 19th century craft box, he knew the truth was far more contemporary and devastating than just the old Adebayo letters. The tap from the air duct returned, sharp and demanding, forcing Meki's eyes upward. The mysterious sentinel was waiting, listening, knowing the ritual was almost complete, and Meki and Ilara were now faced with an agonizing choice. Use the key to escape, or reveal the final modern secret hidden on the SD card to the orchestrator of their imprisonment. The betrayal wasn't history. It was happening right now, in the relentless gaze of the watcher upstairs. Meki's gaze darted between the ornate brass key, the ebony lockbox, and the tiny, modern micro SD card resting in his palm. The contrast between the ancient artistry of the box, a testament to generational secrets, and the digital modernity of the card, a tool for instantaneous global exposure, was stark and terrifying. Ilara watched him, her eyes pleading with him to choose wisdom over impulsivity, to finally prioritize their immediate safety. Meki knew the brass key, the one carved with the magnolia branch, was not meant for the old deadbolt upstairs. Its intricate teeth and shape clearly pointed toward an older, smaller lock, perhaps the one securing a hidden compartment within the house's infrastructure, a lock that Aunt Zora had deliberately kept open, leaving only the key as a historical marker. He carefully slid the SD card into the memory port of his old, rugged site inspection tablet, a device he kept in the basement workbench cabinet for accessing blueprints, which, crucially, was not connected to the house's Wi-Fi. The tapping from the air duct stopped completely, the sentinel upstairs clearly holding its breath, sensing the climax of the basement drama. The tablet screen flickered to life, its glow illuminating Meki and Ilara's anxious faces in the cramped, concrete space. The SD card contained only one folder, labeled with a single, evocative word: truth. Meki tapped the folder, and the contents unfolded like a damning scroll of digital evidence. The archive was breathtaking in its scope and chilling in its detail. It wasn't just a handful of old letters. It was a comprehensive, meticulously documented legal history. Scanned deeds, mortgage applications, court transcripts, and dozens of high-resolution photographs of historical property lines in Cypress Route. The most devastating files, however, were two encrypted videos. Meki selected the first, a short clip dated just 5 years prior, roughly the time of Aunt Zora's passing. The video was a shaky recording, filmed secretly, showing an elderly, distinguished-looking black man sitting across a large mahogany desk from a much younger Cairo, who was then barely 16. The older man was holding a stack of the same Adebayo letters Meki had just recovered from beneath the floor. Your grandfather, Elias Ames, did not just take the house, Cairo. The older man's voice, which was the same calm, cultured voice from the air duct, resonated clearly from the tablet's small speaker. He took the very root of the Adebayo family's prosperity in this country. My great-grandfather, Okonkwo, was poised to become one of the wealthiest black landowners in Charleston. Elias used a moment of deep family crisis, my great-uncle's false imprisonment, to steal the deed. That betrayal, Cairo, is why your home, this beautiful house, sits on land soaked in another family's tears. The man in the video then reached over and gave Cairo a small black ebony lockbox, the very one sitting on the workbench. This was the moment of Cairo's recruitment and the beginning of the betrayal. Ilara watched her son's face in the video, young, horrified, and intensely focused. The weight of his family's sin, the systemic cruelty of his ancestors' actions against a member of their own community, had clearly been too much for the conscientious young man to bear. Cairo hadn't been coerced. He had been convinced of the need for justice by the Adebayo heir. Meki paused the video, his shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of the revelation. Cairo had not discovered the secret. It had been presented to him as a moral indictment, a call to action by the family he had wronged. The older man in the video was clearly Professor Zayed Adebayo, the Adebayo heir Cairo had met through his university connections, the same man speaking through the air duct. Meki and Ilara had spent years praising Cairo's pursuit of social justice through architecture, only to discover that his passion had led him into a morally complex plot against them, a plot designed to return the property to its rightful lineage. Meki then opened the second video, dated just 2 weeks ago. This one was far more disturbing. It was a clandestine recording of a conversation between Professor Adebayo and Cairo, filmed inside the Queen Anne's living room. Cairo looked strained, anxious, clearly grappling with the finality of their plan. The lockbox must be placed beneath the water main, Cairo, Professor Adebayo instructed calmly in the video. It is the physical trigger for their guilt. They must find the papers, they must read the truth, and they must be contained until the sun rises. We need only the acknowledgement of the debt, not the key. The key to the truth is the only leverage we need, Cairo asked, his voice shaking in the recording. And if they refuse, Professor, if they refuse to acknowledge the theft? Adebayo smiled thinly, a calculated, cold expression. Then the entire digital archive goes to the Charleston Historical Society at dawn. They lose the house, and your father loses his reputation and career. We do not want retribution, Cairo. We want restitution. They must confess their family's original sin. The video ended abruptly, leaving the chilling realization that Cairo had executed this entire terrifying scenario, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, ethical compulsion to save his parents from utter ruin by forcing a moral confession. The lockbox wasn't the secret. It was the catalyst for their reckoning. Meki looked up at the air duct, his eyes burning with a mixture of fear, shame, and a desperate surge of paternal love for the morally compromised but deeply principled son who had just trapped them. He looked down at the brass skeleton key, the true lock. Ilara reached out, her fingers closing over the key in his hand. The key isn't for the house, Meki. It's for the truth. Zora didn't want you to keep the secret. She wanted you to find the key to restitution before the Adebayos did. They had to use the key not to escape the basement, but to unlock a solution that satisfied Zaid Adebayo and saved Cairo from the disastrous consequences of his own moral justice. Meki knew the house's structure intimately. He realized the ornate key might not open a literal lock, but perhaps a hidden electrical panel or a fuse box, something tied to the historic infrastructure of the Queen Anne. He raised the lantern again, his eyes scanning the original stonework of the foundation, looking for the tiny, almost imperceptible notch that would finally complete Zora's complicated, beautiful, and devastating inheritance. Ilara and Meki, united by the terrifying clarity of the betrayal, now focused on the ancient brass key, realizing it was not a tool for escape, but a spiritual cipher for restitution. Meki, his engineering instincts humming despite the emotional devastation, aimed the powerful LED lantern beam across the thick, rough-cut stone foundation walls, the true root of the 150-year-old house. He scanned for any anomaly, any small crack or discoloration that didn't align with the original masonry, searching for the lock that wasn't a physical bolt, but a mechanism hidden by time and design. His eyes finally caught a spot about 4 feet up the wall, nestled between two massive granite blocks, a tiny, almost imperceptible sliver of wood paneling that looked completely out of place against the rough stone. The panel was the size of an index card, and it was deliberately carved with a pattern of 3 small, interlocking ovals, a subtle, stylized version of the Adinkra symbol, the Nyame Dua, or God's altar, that was also etched onto the ebony lockbox. This was the final marker, Aunt Zora's true legacy, the location of the physical key to resolving the ancestral debt. Meki gently pressed the intricate teeth of the brass magnolia key against the tiny wooden panel. With a smooth, well-oiled snick, the panel recessed slightly, revealing a small, shallow cavity containing not another document, but a single, heavy, solid gold signet ring. The ring was deeply engraved with the crest of the Ames family, a stylized ram. But it was far older and more valuable than any piece of modern jewelry. Meki recognized the crest, but Ilara recognized the profound significance of the ring itself. She remembered a story from Meki's grandmother about the original patriarch, Elias Ames, having a token of debt he carried with him. Not a shame, but a physical guarantee he had to pay off if he ever wanted true peace. The ring was not about wealth, it was about value. Meki slowly slipped the heavy ring onto his index finger, the cold weight settling on his skin like a heavy moral burden. Just as he did, the muffled voice of Professor Adebayo, strained but calm, drifted down from the air duct. "The sun will rise in 2 hours, Mr. Ames. Do you have the acknowledgement, or does the archive go public?" Ilara, realizing the gold ring was the currency of their freedom, not the lock itself, suddenly understood the mechanism of Zora's plan. She looked at Meki's engineering tablet, which still contained the damning digital archive. Meki, Zora didn't want you to destroy the evidence. She wanted you to have the leverage to make the Adebayos whole, without destroying Cairo's future. She pointed to the files on the tablet. The digital archive is the proof of the theft. The ring is the proof of Elias's guilt and his original collateral. We have to show Professor Adebayo that we are prepared to pay the debt in full, not just morally, but tangibly. And then we leverage his agreement with Cairo. Meki nodded, his eyes alight with a renewed sense of purpose. He picked up the tablet, aimed the brilliant LED light at the air duct, and spoke directly into the darkness, his voice ringing with a conviction that surpassed his previous fear. Professor Adebayo, my son Cairo is upstairs. You used him and manipulated his moral compass to set this trap. That is not restitution. That is generational cruelty. Meki's voice was steady, cutting through the silence. I have the Adebayo archive. It is intact. I also have the original token of debt, the collateral Elias Ames put down when he stole this house. He raised his hand, the gold ring catching the harsh glare of the lantern. This ring is the proof that Elias knew he was wrong, and that the original debt was not just the house, but the Adebayo family's future prosperity. It is worth far more than the current market value of this property. He paused, letting the heavy implications settle. I am prepared to offer you the ring and the full market value of this house, but only under one condition. You must open this door, and you must absolve Cairo of his involvement. He is your recruit, and you will ensure his academic future remains untouched. The silence from the air duct stretched, thick and painful, for nearly a minute. Ilara could hear her own heart hammering against her ribs, the terrifying gamble of their entire future resting on the moral integrity of the man upstairs. Finally, Professor Adebayo's voice returned, lower, stripped of its earlier authority, edged with a complicated mix of professional disappointment and ethical recognition. You are more resourceful than Elias Ames, Mr. Ames. You seek to pay the debt in full, not just hide from it. But my agreement with Cairo was the only insurance I had. He believed he was acting for a greater good, and he deserves to be protected. The tension in the air was palpable. This was the moment of ultimate revelation, the moment of choosing forgiveness over revenge. Open the door, Professor, Ilara finally interjected, her voice clear and strong. Do not let generational revenge destroy another Black family. We acknowledge the debt. Now, let us begin the restitution. After another agonizing pause, the heavy thunk of the mahogany hutch being dragged backward scraped across the floor above. Then, the rhythmic, loud jiggle of the deadbolt being retracted. The sound of freedom, but also the terrifying sound of the confrontation they could no longer avoid. The basement door swung open slowly, revealing Cairo standing in the hallway, his body slumped, his eyes red and swollen. And beside him, Professor Zayed Adebayo, a man whose face, illuminated by the dawn's early light filtering through the landing window, was etched with decades of inherited sorrow and the strain of his own moral conflict. The sight of their son, Cairo, slumped and heartbroken on the landing, was more devastating to Ilara and Meki than any dark cellar. He wasn't defiant. He was shattered. His act of betrayal had been rooted in a perverse form of ethical integrity, a desperate attempt to force his parents to do what he perceived as morally right before the Adebayo family, now represented by Professor Zayed. Adebayo took everything from them. The professor, a man in his mid-50s, with the commanding presence of an academic and the weary eyes of a historian, stood a few feet back, his expression unreadable. The harsh LED light from Meki's lantern momentarily blinded them as Ilara rushed up the stairs, bypassing the silent Adebayo to pull her son into a crushing, desperate embrace. Cairo sobbed violently into his mother's shoulder, releasing weeks, perhaps months, of agonizing, internalized conflict. Meki followed Ilara, stepping into the hallway, leaving the subterranean shadows behind. He didn't approach Cairo immediately. His first obligation was to the man whose ancestors his own had wronged. He stood before Professor Adebayo, the gold signet ring heavy on his finger, the tablet containing the archive tucked firmly under his arm. This confrontation, staged on the central landing of the Queen Anne house, the very threshold of the stolen property, was not just between two men, but between 2 centuries of Black history, one of opportunism and internalized oppression, and the other of resilience and the desperate fight for reclamation. Meki looked Adebayo in the eye, extending the hand bearing the gold ring. "Professor Adebayo," Meki stated, his voice now loud and unwavering, "we acknowledge the theft. We acknowledge the harm my grandfather, Elias Ames, caused your family, not just the loss of property, but the loss of community standing and opportunity. That betrayal was a wound in our community's history. This ring was Elias's original collateral, a promise he never honored. It is yours, along with the full market value of the house, which we will transfer to your family's foundation immediately." Meki paused, allowing the weight of the enormous, life-altering commitment to settle. "In return, you will use your influence to ensure Cairo's academic future remains untouched." He acted on a misguided but deeply felt moral compulsion. He is our son, and he acted to ensure justice was served. The terms were stark, final, and demanded an immediate, irrevocable commitment from both parties. Professor Adebayo looked down at the extended hand and the gleaming gold ring. His expression remained neutral, yet a tremor passed through his lips. He finally spoke, his voice carrying the deep resonance of a man who had dedicated his life to documenting these very injustices. "Cairo came to me 6 months ago. He found one of Aunt Zora's old letters mentioning the Adebayo sorrow. He was devastated, not by the potential loss of the house, but by the hypocrisy. He wanted to do the right thing, Mr. Ames. He did not want to destroy you. He wanted to save your integrity." Adebayo did not take the ring, but gently pushed Meki's hand back. "The true cost is not the gold, Mr. Ames. The true cost is the acknowledgement. Cairo did that for me." Adebayo then made a move no one expected. He took out his own phone, which was clearly recording, and showed Cairo a private video. It was the original conversation between Adebayo and Cairo, where Cairo detailed his discovery and his desire for justice. Adebayo then deleted the video file right in front of Cairo, ensuring no trace of the conspiracy remained. "My great-grandfather, Okonkwo Adebayo, was ruined by a paper debt," Zayed explained, looking at Cairo. "I will not ruin a young Black man's future over a moral debt. I have the acknowledgement from your father. That is enough." He then looked back at Meki. "I have no desire to own this house, Mr. Ames. I want to establish the Okonkwo Adebayo Foundation for land justice, right here in Cypress Root. I ask that you do not sell the house, but instead deed 49% of the property to the foundation, making it a shared asset. You keep your home, and we establish a visible, enduring symbol of reconciliation and restitution, a shared legacy built on truth." This proposal was not revenge. It was an act of profound, empowering forgiveness, transforming the stolen property into a monument of healing. Meki, overwhelmed, could only nod, his voice thick with emotion. Ilara, still holding Cairo, looked at her husband, tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of overwhelming gratitude, and of the sudden, complete knowledge that their family's pain had been worth the ultimate, necessary truth. The shame was gone, replaced by a shared, challenging, and profoundly ethical future. The confrontation ended, not with a dramatic signing of papers, but with a silent, shared commitment between the two men, brokered by the broken heart of the son. Professor Adebayo, having secured the acknowledgement he sought and initiated the path to restitution, quietly gathered his few belongings and walked out the front door, leaving the Ames family in the charged silence of their home, now completely changed. The morning sun, rising high over the historic Cypress Root neighborhood, streamed through the windows, casting long dusty beams across the hallway, a sharp visual contrast to the sickly yellow glow of the basement. Ilara and Meki finally turned their full attention to Cairo, who remained slumped against the wall, utterly spent, his initial fear now replaced by an exhausted, profound guilt. Ilara knelt, meeting his gaze. "Cairo, baby, why didn't you just tell us? Why this elaborate, terrifying theater?" Her voice was soft, laced with both lingering pain and fierce understanding. Cairo, struggling to articulate the crushing weight he had carried, explained the genesis of his agonizing decision. He recounted how Professor Adebayo had initially tried to approach Meki through official channels years ago, only to be rebuffed with cold, professional deflection. Meki, still terrified by Zora's warning, had instinctively closed ranks, treating the Adebayos as threats to his professional integrity rather than victims of a historical wrong. This rejection cemented Cairo's belief that his father would never willingly surrender the secret or acknowledge the debt. He felt he had no choice but to use the only leverage he had, the moral integrity of the Ames name within the community. "I couldn't stand it, Mama," Cairo whispered, the tears returning. "I saw Dad building his entire career, his reputation, his legacy, all on top of a foundation of historical injustice against another Black family. We talk about empowering our people, about closing the wealth gap, but our foundation was a lie. I had to force the acknowledgement. I knew Professor Adebayo wouldn't hurt you physically. I just needed the leverage of the truth to force Dad's confession before Adebayo released the archive publicly and destroyed his life entirely." Cairo's act, while terrifying, was a profound statement of his own moral foundation, a son determined to cleanse his family's conscience, even at the cost of their temporary terror and his own relationship with them. His ethical compass, honed by their own teachings, had turned against them, demanding accountability. Meki sat down heavily next to his son, the heavy gold ring now tucked away in his pocket, a silent, powerful reminder of the debt he was finally ready to pay. He placed a hand on Cairo's shoulder, not in condemnation, but in a heavy, honest acceptance. "You were right, son. I chose to hide the truth out of shame and fear, and I let that shame become another form of injustice. You didn't betray us. I betrayed you by making you carry a moral burden that should have been mine alone." The raw honesty of the admission, the full and total acceptance of responsibility, finally broke the emotional tension that had been sustaining Cairo's adrenaline. The father and son held each other, their embrace a powerful scene of painful, essential reconciliation. The family conflict, born of a generational secret, had finally yielded to an honest, healing truth. The first few hours after the liberation were spent in a whirlwind of emotional and practical reality. Meki contacted his lawyer and began the immediate process of legally deeding 49% of the property to the newly established Okonkwo Adebayo Foundation, ensuring that the Queen Anne House would officially become a symbol of shared ownership and reconciliation within Cypress Root. Ilara, meanwhile, deleted the Adebayo archive from Meki's tablet and burned the brittle Adebayo letters in the kitchen fireplace, ensuring the paper trail of their ancestors' shame was finally and permanently erased. The gold signet ring, the original collateral, was sent via courier to Professor Adebayo's office, a gesture not of payment, but of respect. The Ames family home was no longer solely theirs. It was a community asset, a permanent, visible reminder that true Black prosperity must be built on a foundation of honesty and mutual support, not on internal betrayal. Their terror had ended, but their new, morally challenging life had just begun. The following week was a blur of legal paperwork, honest conversations, and the slow, necessary process of rebuilding trust between parents and son. The legal agreement was finalized quickly. The Ames family retained 51% ownership and residency of the house, while the Okonkwo Adebayo Foundation held the remaining 49%, using the space for community events, historical archives, and educational seminars on land justice and property ownership. The Queen Anne House, once a silent monument to betrayal, was now a loud, living symbol of atonement and restorative justice. The neighborhood of Cypress Root buzzed with the news, the community watching the unlikely reconciliation unfold with a mixture of awe and profound respect. The Ames family had chosen truth over secrecy, and the community saw the strength in their vulnerability. Ilara and Meki devoted hours to Cairo, listening, truly listening, to the depth of his ethical pain and acknowledging the moral courage it took for him to risk everything for what he believed was right. Cairo's final confession was the hardest to hear. His greatest fear wasn't losing the house, but the possibility that his parents, whom he idolized, might have been complicit in a continuing cover-up. I needed to know that the legacy I was carrying forward, the Ames name, was honest, he told them, his eyes still carrying the shadow of his guilt. If I was going to be an architect, building foundations for people, I needed to know my own foundation wasn't built on stolen ground. His honesty was the final, devastating blow, confirming that his act of betrayal had been the ultimate test of their shared values, and one they had ultimately passed, albeit painfully. The revelation to the outside world came swiftly but gently. Professor Adebayo, true to his word, used the Ames family's cooperation as a centerpiece for the launch of the foundation. At a press conference held in the Queen Anne's newly designated community room, formerly the formal dining room, he stood side by side with Meki and Ilara. Adebayo did not expose the theft. Instead, he spoke eloquently about reconciliation. This house, he declared, gesturing to the restored wooden walls, was once the site of a profound generational wrong between two Black families. Today, through the selfless, courageous actions of the Ames family, particularly their son Cairo, this house is now a model for how restorative justice and truth-telling can heal historical wounds and strengthen our community's future. Meki, finding a strength he hadn't known he possessed, then spoke about the burden of the secret, detailing the shame he had carried, and praising Cairo's ultimate moral intervention. He publicly announced his donation of the gold signet ring to the foundation, establishing a permanent scholarship fund in Okonkwo Adebayo's name for students studying land and property rights. Ilara, standing next to her husband and son, spoke about the moral lesson learned, that silence is not protection, it is complicity. The event was emotional, raw, and empowering, a powerful visual testament to the depth and resilience of Black American family bonds, even when tested by the sins of the past. The audience, local residents, historians, and students were moved to tears by the honesty of the Ames family's reckoning. The story was not of a betrayal that destroyed a family, but of a necessary crisis that reforged it stronger and truer than before. Cairo left for his fellowship in New York a few weeks later, not as a fleeing son, but as a young man of profound moral fiber, carrying the honest, unburdened Ames name into the future. His relationship with his parents was raw, healed, and fundamentally stronger, built now on the foundation of shared, painful truth. The basement door, once the symbol of their imprisonment and the lockbox of their secrets, was left slightly ajar, symbolizing the family's new commitment to absolute transparency. 1 year later, the Queen Anne House in Cypress Root stood as a vibrant testament to the power of truth. The basement, once the dank, frightening vault of their generational secret, had been professionally waterproofed, painted a light, inviting gray, and converted into the Foundation's Okonkwo Adebayo Archive reading room. The hollow spot where the Adebayo letters had been buried was preserved under a sheet of clear, protective glass, a small, subtle reminder embedded in the floor of the importance of an honest foundation. Meki and Ilara lived their lives with a radical, refreshing transparency, their marriage profoundly deepened by the crisis they had endured. Meki had integrated land justice into his engineering consultancy, using his expertise to help the Foundation clear complicated titles for other marginalized families in Charleston. Ilara, at the library, launched an intergenerational oral history project focused on Black land ownership and the struggle for equity. Cairo, thriving in New York, returned frequently. His visits centered not on the house, but on his work with the Foundation, contributing architectural design pro bono for future community centers. His relationship with Professor Adebayo had transformed from co-conspirators to true colleagues, a powerful symbol of intergenerational healing and cooperation. The family's final emotional release came during the Foundation's 1-year anniversary celebration, held in the sun-drenched halls of their shared home. Meki, looking out at the diverse crowd of students, elders, and community leaders, took Ilara's hand. He spoke to the audience, his words simple, clear, and coming directly from the heart. A year ago, Ilara and I were locked in the basement of this house by our son. We were locked in by fear, by shame, and by a lie that our ancestor had buried generations ago. Cairo forced us to face that truth, Meki said, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't betray us. He gave us the greatest gift a child can give his parents, uncompromising moral clarity. He showed us that the legacy we build must be based on truth, not on possessions. Ilara stepped forward, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the community. Our moral lesson is simple, but it cost us everything to learn it. The debt of a historical wrong can only be paid in the currency of current truth. You cannot build an honorable future on a dishonest past. Our son forced us to unlock the true legacy of the Ames family, not wealth, but the strength to be accountable. The resolution was complete. The family was healed, the historical debt was paid, and the house had been transformed from a symbol of betrayal into a pillar of community empowerment. The truest foundation of family legacy and community prosperity is built on accountability and honest reconciliation with the past. Silence is not protection. It is the seed of future betrayal. Be brave enough to face the sins of your ancestors so your children do not have to. Engage and subscribe. Did Cairo do the right thing by trapping his parents, or was his method too extreme? How would you have handled the secret? What does the shared ownership of the house, 51% Ames, 49% of Foundation, symbolize to you about restorative justice? What painful family truths do you think should be revealed, and what should remain private?